Having given up on the idea of becoming a leader in the interpersonal communication workshop, I was busy enough leading motivation workshops and the management practices course uh, to keep me happy and busy when something unusual came up. I was approached by Ned Herman, who was Bob Harper's superior in General Electric, with the idea that of would I be interested in going to Brazil to lead two courses in the motivation workshop for English speaking GE employees in Brazil. And I thought that was absolutely marvelous. Uh, he said that I could take Babe if I wanted to. In other words, they would pay for her transportation and stay in Brazil as well as my own. Uh, I wondered why I was being sent, and he told me that Bob Harper didn't want to go because he wanted to go with his girlfriend, and Ned Herman wanted to go, and one other leader of GE, and so they turned down Bob Harper's uh, going, and he got upset and said, well, if I can't take my girlfriend, I'm not interested in going at all. And that's what made the space for me to go. I was brought in to talk to somebody at GE about the trip, and they told me that one of the problems was taking the films to Brazil, that they were afraid if we tried to send them, they would hold them up in the shipping for possibly months because they didn't want to allow outside movies to come in. They wanted things that they produced right in Brazil. So that was a problem because we needed the films to run the programs. They said that if the leaders took the films with them as part of their luggage, they would arrange to have a friendly inspector uh, at the point where you entered Brazil, and he would pass them through. Well, this intrigue sounded terrific to me that I'd be part of, and so I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And so we arranged for this to happen in about a month or two, and Babe was thrilled with going, the idea of going, and we decided that since we the trip was being paid for by GE, we would use it to do a little sightseeing, and we decided to fly to Lima, Peru, and spend 2 days in Lima, and then fly up to Cusco, which was about 13,000 feet in elevation, and the approach to visit Machu Picchu. And then after that, fly to Brazil in time to meet the friendly inspector who would allow the films in, and be ready to give the course in a couple of days. The flight from Lima to Cusco was interesting in that you started at sea level and ended up in the mountains at 13,000 feet altitude, which was difficult for the body to take. Most people get headaches, and they're given, when they get to the airport, they're given a drink with some drug in it to alleviate the effects of altitude. Most people are getting a headache, and Babe was affected strongly by it when we got off the plane, and it affected her for another day or so. We went to a small hotel, Cusco being a fairly small town in the mountains, with plenty of sights to see, many people of Indian derivation rather than Caucasian, and a lot to see. Babe was troubled by the altitude, and wasn't completely herself for the first day there. We had arranged, or somebody had arranged for us to go to Machu Picchu the next day. Machu Picchu being this small ruins of a Indian castle or retreat, a safe place for high officials to go to, on the top of a mountain far away from any other big cities. And it had been resurrected by Brazilian officials to show it the way, or for people to go and visit and see it as the way it was about 600 years earlier. Now, the way to get to Machu Picchu, the common way was to take a train from Cusco at 8 in the morning, and it would take 4 hours by train to get to Machu Picchu, and it entailed going through the mountains and going over high peaks and then to a slightly lower altitude for Machu Picchu. When we were on the train, we started up the mountains and stopped and then reversed and went back down backwards, stopped, and then started up again. I thought this was kind of unusual. I wondered why we didn't just go straight. And I asked the conductor about it, and he said the altitude was that the train was going up to get over the mountains was so high that the power of the train, the engine, couldn't make it. So they kind of zigzagged up, going up, sliding back at another angle and making another attempt to go up. And that's the way we went over, the train went over the mountains. They couldn't go straight. They had to zigzag up the mountains and go over. And that was one of the reasons that it took so long to go. It was probably 50 or 60 miles straight, but by the zigzag, it took much longer. As I said, the trip took 4 hours. Anyway, we got to Machu Picchu at about noontime, and I think we had taken, we either had taken some sandwiches or there were people alongside of the train so that when the train stopped, they sold us some food, a local food, and that itself was interesting. But finally, when we did get up, these views were spectacular, and there was much to see of the remains of an ancient small city. And it wasn't like hundreds of people had lived there. It was more of a nobility that used it as a retreat to hide from the Spaniards who might chase them and kill them, since that was what was going on there in the 1500s. Anyway, it was the most exciting experience, and unforgettable, I would say. One of the interesting things was a young boy of about 12 or 13 who, when we departed from Machu Picchu by bus to go down to where the train had left us, there was a path that he was on that went straight down, whereas the bus followed a circular route to descend at a slower rate. It kind of meandered down the mountains, going around them rather than straight down. And this kid ran a straight path down and was demonstrating that he could beat the bus going down, so that by the time we got to the lower end where we were ready to get on the train, he had arrived ahead of us and looked for any gifts or money that the people would give for demonstrating his prowess in running down the hill. That was a kind of memorable thing from our visit to Machu Picchu. After this interesting stop in Peru and the sightseeing there, we flew to Rio de Janeiro, which was a spectacular city on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean with terrific bays and beaches. And we found a GE employee who we knew and had preceded us to Brazil, and I guess he was instrumental in getting our films through customs. He knew the right man to go through, and had probably paid him off. And he escorted us to a lovely hotel on the beach, and saw us safely ensconced in lovely rooms with a nice view of the ocean, and arranged for sightseeing for the next 2 days, in which we saw the downtown of Rio de Janeiro, as well as the beach area and some of the favelas or hovels that were placed where people lived on the mountain above the city of Rio de Janeiro. And as a matter of fact, their sewage ran down this mountain and into the lovely bay or beach of Rio de Janeiro. And so the waters weren't clean then. I'm sure that continued, and right now when they're holding the Olympics down there, nobody wants to swim in those waters. At any rate, we also, the next day, visited the gigantic statue of the Christ of the Andes that was built on the top of one of the mountain peaks above Rio de Janeiro. And almost anybody who visits Rio de Janeiro the first time has to go up and see this statue. It really was one of the great wonders of the world. So we did that with him, and we stayed a couple of days in Rio, and then on one day on either I guess it was the Sunday before the course started on Monday, we were driven up to a little town called Persepolis, where at another hotel, our course, the motivation workshop, was going to take place with the employees of Brazilian General Electric. I remember that our room had, instead of two beds, which we would have preferred, one each for Babe and me, it had a big round bed with a mirror up on top. That for our own sightseeing, but it wasn't something that we were not used to sleeping in the same bed, but we managed. And at any rate, on that Monday, we started our program. I was leading it with another GE person from Crotonville who was in charge of the MPC course, Management Practices course, and he also was a leader of the motivation workshop. We were working together. As we started the program, we asked for feedback from the participants as to how were they understanding us as we were speaking in English. And we found that about half of our students or participants in the program from Brazil were American born, and their English was perfect. But the other half were Brazilians who had just a modicum of English. So they barely understood what we were talking about. As a matter of fact, they weren't getting it. And so we had to slow down and have the American-speaking employees tell the others in Portuguese what we had just said. Well, this slowed us down quite a bit, but it was the only way that we could keep going and have the whole class understand what we were talking about. We made that adaptation and worked five days from Monday to Friday, so that we, as the instructors and the participants, all felt that they had gotten value from the program. While the classwork was going on for 5 days, Babe was not a participant, but she became friendly with the woman who was the wife of the owner of the hotel, who took her in hand. She spoke English fairly well, and took her sightseeing in Persepolis, and saw that she had a good time. Babe thoroughly enjoyed it. The hotel had a pool, which she used. So she had a lovely time on our trip to Persepolis. and she took pictures and bought some souvenirs during the week. We finished the program on Friday, and on Saturday we were transported the 40 or 50 miles to Sao Paulo. I think we flew from Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paulo, so it must have been more than 50 miles. I remember it was a short plane trip, but that could have been 100 or more miles. And we were kind of surprised when we landed through tall apartment buildings, kind of circling between the buildings to land at this airport, which was practically in the city of Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo at that time was a city of about 15 million people. And they still use this old airport because when you landed there, you were in the city, and it wasn't too hard to get to the hotels or wherever you were going. On Monday, we started a second program for another 20 or so members of GE Brazil, and we gave them another program, gave them the motivation workshop, finishing on Friday. And I would say that the second time we were a little more adept at getting the people who were had only a meager understanding of English more into the program. We knew exactly how much time we had to spend and where to stop for the Americans in the group to relay to the Brazilians in the group what we were trying to say as leaders. From the feedback we got at the end of the programs, we found that the participants really enjoyed the programs and got a lot out of it, and that it was worthwhile making that trip for two of us to go down and visit them and give this workshop. It wasn't only what they got from the workshop, but the fact that GE was willing to spend that much money to have them get the benefit of a Crotonville program. Also, it was a lot cheaper for GE to send 2 instructors down there than to send 40 people up to America. So all in all, it worked well. And after the 2 programs were over, Babe and I were ready to return north, and we decided to make a stop at Manaus, which was 1,000 miles up the Amazon River and pretty nearly on the equator. One of the reasons that we did that was because I wanted to see the famous opera house in Manaus that was about 100 years old and had been built by the rubber plantation owners for themselves to have operas put on. They were making so much money in those days growing rubber and selling it because there wasn't artificial rubber. It would all had to be natural. And it was very expensive, and they were making a fortune, so much so that they could build this beautiful opera house that seated about 400 or 500 people. So it was a relatively small but remarkably beautiful building. And as a matter of fact, for the opening of this opera house, they had hired Enrico Caruso, who was the greatest tenor in the world at that time, to sing in the opera that opened the opera house. And he had to travel there by boat from the United States. Probably took 2 weeks to get to Brazil, and then he had to take the 1,000-mile trip up the Amazon to get to Manaus. So it was a very expensive fee that he got from these rubber plantation owners for that opening. We stayed at a hotel in Manaus that was set in a park and had many cages with some of the birds that were native to that area, parrots and other similar creatures, and also some larger animals, so that it was partly an aviary and partly a zoo. And the hotel was quite large, had hundreds of rooms and a beautiful pool. Surrounding the pool was a very wide area of cement with water in the indentations, so that if you wanted to, you could lie down on your stomach and sunbathe your back and be in the water, and then you could turn over and sunbathe your front. The reason they did that was it was just too hot there, being on the equator, to lie on any kind other surface. You had to be halfway in the water. It really was very hot. We also took advantage of a boat trip on the Amazon, because the reason for this city of Manaus on this spot on the Amazon was that this was a confluence of a very large tributary coming down the mountains from Peru and emptying or joining the Amazon River. That whole trip was very interesting because from the boat you could see the trees on the shore were submerged for the 4 or 5 feet of their trunks in water, and they grew that way through the water, uh, and obviously were healthy because they never lacked enough water, and they evidently were inured to that kind of existence. It was quite a trip by boat to see that, and very interesting for us to visit the Opera House and see the city of Manaus. Manaus was interesting because it was a free port. In other words, anything coming into Brazil from Manaus was free of taxes. So there were many commercial establishments where they sold electrical equipment, radios, TVs, etc., at lower prices than elsewhere in Brazil.